Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you tuning in today, we welcome you in. Now, I have purposely not been commenting much on the Russia and Ukrainian war because it evokes some pretty controversial thoughts and opinions. But I've read a few things over the past couple of weeks that have made me really question what the future is like. And the funny part is, it actually doesn't matter who wins the war. You might recall at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war that all sorts of Western companies pulled out of there as a sign of protest. Now, I have no problem with companies supporting um, things that fit with their political ideologies, and every company has some sort of political ideology. And pulling out of a market like Russia, that's a big step. Russia isn't the world's largest or second largest economy anymore, but it's still a lot of money coming out of there. And for people like Coca-Cola, Visa, banking services, things that are considered luxury items over there that we consider commonplace here, all that is just going away. Of course, nature abhors a vacuum, as the old story goes. So what happened? China moved in. And they invested in their stock markets. They have been loaning them money to keep the war going. Supposedly, according to Newsweek, China is now going to pull back from that because they've been threatened with economic sanctions. But in the meantime, for the average Muscovite, because everybody knows where Moscow is, where once they had Coca-Cola and Visa, now they have the Chinese versions of the same thing. And I imagine China is able to give them Coke, although Russians traditionally like Pepsi a little more. Because during the Cold War, Pepsi was willing to supply them with beverages in return for vodka. So you could get a hold of Pepsi. Coke was unheard of, just like blue jeans were unheard of. Since China has moved in to the banking services, this is where I'm not optimistic about the future of Russia. We've already seen what happens when that country goes into chaos. Gangs take over, the average citizen is not safe, and business is basically not encouraged. At least not the local mom and pop kind of business that actually generates money and generates jobs. Now, this is a problem because the Chinese are incredibly smart. Nobody denies this. They have rebuilt their country from sticks and stones in the 50s to being an industrial powerhouse in 2024. That's no mean task. And while we can accuse them of industrial espionage and all sorts of shady tactics, you know what? There's not one company out there that doesn't employ it in one form or another. Heck, they have trade shows where they go out and show off their latest product. And if you see that your rival is coming out with a red car, you're going to come out with a red car and a blue car to do them one better. That's just the way things go. If you know the next iPhone or Android or whatever phone you happen to enjoy is going to come with a card reader so you can scan your card anywhere, you're going to try to get that instead of a plain old Nokia that can't do that. But Nokia will be working on that technology in the very near future. So this is not accusing the Chinese of doing anything out of the ordinary. Quite the opposite. Business as usual. For a so-called socialist nation, although they're really authoritarian, they figured out capitalism pretty darn quick. Same with the Russians. If it wasn't for the Russian mafia and their connections, Russia would have recovered into a capitalist upswing pretty quickly. And they did. And they were doing such a good job. I mean, for a time, they were even selling rides on their Soyuz spacecraft because NASA didn't have a spacecraft that could get there. And they'd blown off so many programs that there was no chance of getting one for 10, 15 years. And Russia's like, no problem, comrade. We'll give you a ride. It's only 20 million a seat. And I actually think Russia was giving them a discount. Now here we come back to the problem. The Chinese are so invested in the Russian economy. A Russian defeat means all those Chinese assets are liquidated and not coming back. Secondly, China is kind of once again indirectly supporting their little brothers, the Koreans, the North Koreans in particular. Now on the streets, the Chinese treat the North Koreans kind of like Texans treat Mexicans. And not all of them, but having spoken to people who live in Manchuria, it's the exact same script, copy and paste. Oh, they come here, they run the prostitution, they bring the drugs in, etc., etc. I'm telling you nothing that you haven't heard before. You've heard it from different sources, but you've heard it before. Where this becomes interesting is because most places won't accept a ruble. Remember, for a long time it was illegal to trade in rubles by Russia's own laws, but now people will not accept them, so they can only trade in gold and services. So once this war is over, again, presuming a Russian loss, they have to pay back all this debt. They don't really have anything to pay it back with. Now, the country's gone bankrupt before. There was a time in the 90s where the nuclear submarines were sitting in port, and the Russian power company threatened to cut power to them because the Russian Navy hadn't paid its bill because the Russian minister, or whatever his name is, Tsar, whatever you want to call him, he wasn't able to keep up with the power company's bills because he didn't have the budget. That's scary that anybody would think that was a smart decision. Yeah, cut the nuclear submarines off because they have to shut the reactors down to minimum. They still need to get power to the crew. This actually happened in Russia. So let's do the opposite. Russia does win, and they get to take over all of Ukraine. This is a definite possibility because Russia has more depth at every position. If we want to look at this at a football team, Ukraine is a much smaller country. It has more natural resources, but in terms of people and equipment, it doesn't have the sheer volume that Russia has. And ultimately, as the old general said, it's whoever gets there firstest with the mostest. Now, Russia's infrastructure hasn't allowed them to bring a whole lot up front, but it's still a lot more than Ukraine has been able to really put up a resistance again. The conflict still has to be decided, but if Russia were to win, they would need funding in order to take care of Ukraine's natural resources. One of the biggest funding issues would be the farms. Russia and Ukraine together supply over half of the grain that goes to North Africa. Yeah, and you wonder why we're hearing stories of people starving in Africa. It's because the countries that supply most of the grain are busy fighting each other. Not ideal for anybody. And I thought world pressure would have escalated by now and brought this to a close because nobody wants to see people starving. But nope, they want the 1985 route and they're trying to beg for donations to feed these poor people. See, this conflict is not regional. We're going from China all the way through North Africa. And we haven't even mentioned Europe's investment in Ukraine. They have no interest in losing this conflict because they're showing off their latest weapons and to varying degrees of success, according to the reports. So this is, for lack of better, it's a scrotum measuring competition between Russia and the West. Recently, we've been getting reports out of Russia threatening Poland, saying, "You're next." Well, the senior minister is like, no, 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 nobody said that, even though it's on record that they did, that one minister did in fact say that. And that might be an objective. Poland was a Russian ally in the Eastern Bloc for a heck of a long time. But Russia bears a bit of a grudge against Poland because back in the 15th century, Poland invaded Russia. And they made some pretty good progress before, as the Princess Bride so eloquently said, don't start a land war in Asia. How prescient if they only knew. So, what would we do with Russia collapsing again? Russia last time was more amicable with the United States and was able to say to them, come over, help us inspect our nuclear bombs and nuclear missiles, make sure everything's okay, and the United States jumped at the chance. Not only did they get to examine Soviet technology, but it was a chance to safeguard themselves. And right in the present time, when the United States is not quite so happy with the Russians, USSR, I'm showing my age again, with the Russians, they will probably still be willing to do that, but will Russia be willing to open its borders? It's like Saddam Hussein all over again, where he says, I don't have any chemical weapons. And the UN teams went in, they said, we can't find any chemical weapons. And the United States says, we know they're in there. And I think they found like one underground place where they found some shells that could potentially carry chemical weapons. But that was it. The whole war and everything was based on nothing. The Russian-Ukraine war is based on something, but the end game just doesn't look good on either side. The question is what China wants to do. And ultimately, China wants to take Taiwan. So if they can get the West distracted, if they can get North Korea to kick up enough of a fuss, that's going to draw off a couple carrier groups. And if the Middle East is a hot point, especially in the Mediterranean, that's going to draw a couple aircraft carriers. And the United States only has 11 aircraft carriers, of which one at any time is undergoing refurbishment. Another one is being prepared because crews can only be at sea for a certain amount of time. So realistically, they probably have about 6 aircraft carriers out at sea. That's an extremely limited strike force. And while they can do fantastic things with long-range bombers, aircraft carriers, and submarines launching cruise missiles, the fact is nobody has enough ammunition to keep going. Russia is literally taking artillery weapons that have been mothballed since the Cold War ended, but they have shells in plentiful supply. So they're pushing them back out to the front lines. Now that Russia is running low on funds, again, they have more depth in terms of men and material, and they can do the thing that you learn in high school you should never do, where you print the heck out of your own money if China decides to withdraw its support. But that doesn't work ultimately. There's no situation where this war ends well. You have a Russian collapse, you have a Ukrainian collapse, or some weird kind of stalemate where Ukraine gets into NATO and Russia still tries to figure out a pretext for invading. One of those leads pretty much directly to nuclear war. Let's pray it never comes to that. With that, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Silverlight Show. If you did, please like, share. Don't forget to click the subscribe button because, well, if you haven't clicked that button already. If you can click the bell icon down below, that would be fantastic because, it'll notify you every time we upload a new episode. And we hope you have a fantastic